welcome to an Inpatient Update News Flash. I'm your host, Mason Turner, and this is your podcast for practice-changing evidence for the working hospitalist. Today on the show, we're doing something a little bit different. I've been seeing these headlines about the outbreaks of cyclosporiasis. I'm sure you've been seeing them too. Explosive diarrhea, thousands of cases, bashing Taco Bell, realizing how incredibly dangerous bagged lettuce is. We've been hearing this on the radio. We've been seeing headlines on the news. It's been on social media. This is being covered everywhere. And it makes me ask the question, should this be impacting my practice as I take care of patients at all? And so I decided to delve into that. First, I'll look at the headlines and the numbers that we have. According to the CDC, cyclosporiasis is an intestinal illness caused by the microscopic parasite Cyclospora. People become infected by consuming food or water contaminated with the parasite. It infects the small intestine and typically causes watery diarrhea with frequent and sometimes explosive bowel movements. As of the CDC's last report on July 20th of 2026, there have been more than 4,000 laboratory confirmed cases acquired within the United States since the 1st of May. This spans 41 states and has resulted in 308 hospitalizations. No confirmed deaths yet. In addition to this, there's another 7,000 cases that have been reported to state and local health departments that remain under investigation and are awaiting laboratory confirmation. A lot of the big headlines have been this Taco Bell Taylor Farms lettuce, and specifically a major 5-state outbreak involving at least 1,600 cases has been epidemiologically linked to iceberg lettuce served at Taco Bell. And Taylor Farms de Mexico subsequently recalled iceberg lettuce sourced from central Mexico. But that outbreak accounts for only a subset of the national cases, and the CDC is investigating additional clusters and illnesses unrelated to it. So this is what we have. Thousands of cases, hundreds of hospitalizations, and a microbe that honestly I've scarcely heard of and don't think of often. And many of you, I'm sure, are the same. And as hospitalists, we evaluate patients with diarrhea, hypovolemia, coming into the hospital every day. The question is, given this outbreak we're hearing about in the news, what, if anything, should we be doing different in our practice? I put that question to Dr. Scott Curry, an infectious disease physician and hospital epidemiologist. Here's our conversation. Well, hello, Dr. Curry. Thank you for joining me. To start, could you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Sure. Scott Curry. I'm one of the infectious disease specialists at MUSC. I clinically do a lot of transplant infectious diseases and work closely with our clinical micro lab. And my other hat is medical director of infection control. So I supervise a group of infection preventionists that help evaluate and prevent spread of all kinds of illnesses through this place.
Well, perfect. Obviously makes you just the person we want to talk to for this topic we have here today. So thank you so much for taking your time and chatting with us.
Sure.
Before we get into practice, can you orient us? What is Cyclospora and what should clinicians caring for hospitalized patients understand about the current rise in cases?
Sure. So Cyclospora is not new. We've had our eyes on it for decades. There have been many famous outbreaks, even going back 30 years when I was in medical school. Usually you'd hear about, these are mostly imported foodborne illnesses because Cyclospora is endemic in the tropics and in hot parts of the world where they don't get a winter freeze. So this is often brought back by travelers, but it's not spread person to person. It's a parasitic disease where you do shed oocysts, but they don't emerge from people in an infective form. So you got to try really hard to go person to person with, unlike other parasitic diarrheal illnesses like Giardia and Cryptosporidium, where person to person is pretty easy and well documented. So this is almost exclusively a foodborne illness, getting contaminated products, usually imported foods. It's been lots of famous outbreaks from berries and things that are hard, things that don't get cooked because it's very heat labile. You don't have to cook food very much to get cyclospora to die. So it's basically uncooked stuff. So hence, we're currently focused on lettuce, but there have been outbreaks
Mm-hmm.
associated with spices and basil and raspberries and anything that you don't cook and eat fresh. So unfortunately, all the healthiest foods that we're pushing people to eat are
Right.
probably the highest risk foods. And then, of course, it's until about I'd say 2015, 16 is when we started seeing diagnostics that we use day to day for diagnosing diarrheal illness included it as part of a multiplex PCR panel, the so-called famous GI PCR. Uh, it was on that. It's always been on that for most of my practicing career. And that's when it really started to be found routinely, kind of by mistake, when you were sending tests for outpatient diarrhea. So our current diagnostics in most, academic medical center labs are going to catch it. In the older days, you had to really work at it because you had to either do special acid-fast stains, specifically looking for cryptosporidium and cyclospora to find it, or a dedicated PCR, which only about 2 or 3 reference labs have that FDA validated or lab developed testing. So it's really become easy to diagnose, but we didn't see much of it. Every summer you
Mm-hmm.
have little pockets of cyclospora, and every summer the FDA and USDA would work with CDC and the Food Net surveillance system to see if they could track back to where the sources were, but they hardly ever do, mostly because can you remember what you ate 2 weeks ago? Most of the
No.
incubation period is at least 7 to 10 days, and for many it goes out to 2 weeks. So that's trying to remember all the fresh things you ate that far back is hard. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing such a big outbreak this time through is that our food safety surveillance has fallen apart.
Really.
This year, it's in shambles. We don't do any, for example, when we have a hospitalized patient now testing for salmonella, I don't think people know this. We grow salmonella right here in our academic center micro lab, and we send it to the state. The state will give it a serotype, and if there's a bunch of the same, we'll go to CDC for whole genome sequencing to see, and it traces back to where did the salmonella come from. We stopped doing that for everything else. We used to do that for Campylobacter. We don't do that for Campylobacter, and we certainly don't do it for the parasitic diseases. If we have a Cyclospora case, yeah, it's on the list of reportable conditions that DPH in our state requires us to report to the state, but we don't send
Mm-hmm.
that physical sample to the lab. There's nobody doing any molecular surveillance at all for this. There was
So you
talk,
don't send it just because there's no one there to send it to, or
right?
no one there to look at it.
No one paying to do it, right? And the
Right.
lab that was talking about starting that up was completely defunded last year. So the government can say to their blue in the face, "Oh, this is not exploding this way because we don't invest in food safety," but they're lying. This is not true. The whole food net that apparatus. You go on the CDC website now. Every year I do this because I teach the med students
Mm-hmm.
a course on gastrointestinal illness, and I show them here's this last year's salmonella data and all the food safety net. It's a shambles. Like you can see that there's maybe a third of the detail we used to get from CDC just on salmonella, which we're still truly trying to do some outbreak, but there's more outbreaks that go completely untraced in salmonella than ever nowadays. And it's a minor miracle that we ever found what the source was on this, but it happened. It so happened that Michigan's health department that was really dedicated to finding, oh, why do we all of a sudden have hundreds of now 1,000 excess cases in a state where just like us, they would usually see 20 to 50 cases in a
Mm-hmm.
given summer, and it's because of their effort, not CDC. That we have any clue that it was linked back to one restaurant, because that's all gumshoe epidemiology. You got to call people who are getting these diseases reported to the state, see if they can remember what they had. And of course, that requires a critical mass of people that you're actually doing these tests on, which means that, even though 9% of these people are getting sick enough to get hospitalized, there must have been a critical mass of outpatients getting
Right.
expensive, GI PCRs done on them to find this. As a guarantee, doctors were just randomly thinking about testing for cyclospora when they had negative stool cultures, which is, what in our dreams happened, but doesn't actually happen in real clinical practice. So I think this whole thing blew up to be so big because there's nobody watching the store. We have multi-state
Mm-hmm.
distribution networks, particularly for as you can see, this chopped lettuce manufacturer sending it hither, thither, and yon nationwide. We're lucky we don't have more cases in the U.S. Southeast, but I think it's purely because the lettuce involved, we think, in most of these excess cases is mostly kind of distributed up as far south as kind of Virginia, West Virginia, but doesn't seem to have made it to us. So we're not actually seeing more cyclospora than we usually do in South Carolina yet. But who knows? Yeah, our time will come because the summer is early yet in the incubation period. We're just now this week diagnosing cases that probably got happened around July 4th holiday.
Yeah. Wow. The more I hear about this, the more this seems like outbreaks like this or spikes like this seem like an inevitability, and I'm surprised it's not happening more. I don't really hadn't previously paid attention to like distribution of fresh produce, particularly lettuce. And I mean, you could have any one spot and it goes so many different places. And I think probably now more than ever, you need someone minding the store closer than usual. And then to all the points you make, it sounds like we're getting the opposite of that.
Yeah, and they've actually undone. There was a proposal in federal regs to allow full traceback. So you had to be able to say, "Hey, I'm serving lettuce in restaurant A, but I know who the manufacturer of that lettuce is. I know what facilities processed it, and ultimately I know what farms contributed to the lettuce in that processing facility on that day." And the food industry has basically lobbied to delay implementation of that rule for another 10 to 30 years. So we've been pushing to have full traceback ability. It requires an expensive amount of record keeping. I don't know if you've ever
Sure.
noticed, but when you buy meat at the store, it has a USDA sticker on it. And there's actually a
Mm-hmm.
little letter code on that sticker that tells you exactly where that meat was processed and packed. So if there's ever an outbreak of salmonella, that's the first place you go is, hey, can you find out, go in your fridge and tell me what's the brand, but not only what the brand is, what's the USDA stamp on that, what's the facility code, and then the
Mm-hmm.
USDA can send inspectors into that place and they can do cultures, they can observe practices. We don't have anything like that for vegetables. Like that's the US FDA is what is responsible. That's their agency that handles our
Mm-hmm.
vegetables and produce, and they don't have that same kind of sticker. And that, putting that kind of a sticker on our vegetables would be expensive because a lot of bags of lettuce would probably have a whole list of different facilities contributing the stuff that's in that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it would be expensive and it might raise food prices some, but I think the investment would be worth it because look, now we have a nationwide outbreak of a disease, and this disease is not pleasant. I mean, I take issue with calling anything explosive diarrhea. I don't think,
That's such a buzzword.
like, what is there? Gentle, reassuring diarrhea? But I think the key thing about cyclospora as an illness that people aren't stressing enough, it's so chronic.
Mm.
It will get better for 95% of people. This does not require treatment, but you will be sick if you don't treat it for a solid month or a month and a half for many people. That's a
Wow.
miserable because it's not. There's very little upper GI symptoms in cyclospora. It's just this chronic, remitting, relapsing, gassy gastroenteritis where you can't be continent fecally for a while, and it's just highly unpleasant. And here's the other thing that the media is not talking about: we don't have a treatment if you're self-allergic. If you got a
Mm.
self-allergy, you're
Mm-hmm.
done. There is a limited amount of evidence that Cipro might do something in an old outbreak in Haiti, but it was pretty iffy. But we really don't have any proved treatment. And we always say consult ID if you're self-allergic. Well, I don't know what I tell people if they have now desensitize. We've even tried things like giving trimethoprim only, which exists as a
Hmm.
therapeutic for UTIs for self-allergic patients. Even that doesn't seem to do much. So we really are stuck with this disease. It's extremely difficult to treat, especially in the immunocompromised with self-allergies. Those folks just
Mm-hmm.
sometimes just have to get supported through it and tough it out.
Okay. So clinically, as a hospitalist, if I take a case, if I have a 70 something year old lady comes in the hospital, very hypovolemic, hyponatremia, AKI, dry, and reports poor oral intake and diarrhea. We see this kind of patient all the time. It's bread and butter of what we admit to the hospital. Should this outbreak be changing how we think about that patient, or what nuances of that patient would make us think we need to test?
I think the chronicity is the biggest clinical clue, right? And that's the
Okay.
same for Giardia, Cryptosporidium, some of the things. So I think people need to ask the questions they need to ask of anybody with gastroenteritis are the ones I wish they would ask in the ER or in the first hospitalist visit, right? Take a food
Mm-hmm.
history because most gastroenteritis that's acute is fortunately a short incubation period. So the norovirus you ate is whatever you weighed about 1 to 3 days ago. So at least take a food history going back 3 days. Can you remember? And, what did you eat? Any shared meals with others were also sick or particularly important. But, in general, what is it you eat? Are you eating high risk things? Are you drinking raw milk? Are you eating Caesar salad with unpasteurized eggs? Stuff like that. And then what restaurants? What are the names of those restaurants? Put that in your note because we will read that. Like I see, when there is a state health department investigation, the first thing they will look at is the H&Ps and the ER notes, seeing if there's any
Okay.
specifics there that are useful so that you don't have to call the patient up and get it from them. So it's obviously you're closer in time to the exposure, you're less likely to have recall bias and all that. Uh, so that's important. City water versus well water. Always telling our med students to take that history. It's important because well water is an important source of cryptosporidium. And then obviously with the current outbreak, that food history should focus on what all are you eating that's fresh.
Mm-hmm.
And where do you buy it? Is it all at restaurants and what are the names of those restaurants, or do you buy it at the grocery store and its brand name versus store brand? Even that amount of information can help us in the back end. But again, if you're really going to want to track back to diseases like this, you got to go way back in time, up to 2 weeks back, to get that. And of course, clinically, in a big medical center, you're likely to order a multiplex GI PCR panel, which is going
Mm-hmm.
to cover all of the bases from norovirus to salmonella to campylobacter to Giardia cryptosporidium. So what you do not ever want to do, ever, and I wish I could send this to the rooftops and get every hospitalist is please stop sending ova and parasite exams. That is the
Okay, perfect. That was
that
a question on my list.
marvelous test in medicine. We have local data here. With the last 250 tests we sent, we have one positive, and it was from a child in like our adoption clinic that was an overseas adoptee, and even that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't really a significant positive. But if you're not looking for worm eggs, which we don't have endemic any part of the United States, except for pinworms, which is not going to be found very effectively on a stool and parasite exam. And if you don't want to look for strongyloides, which is you're way better to use the blood IgG than you are to use the stool test. There is nothing that you're going to find on a stool ova and parasite exam, and it will miss cyclospora because there's no acid fast component. It's also a messy test. It I was trained to do them. It's just the most horrible test in lab medicine. It's a trichrome stain. So you got to sit there and float it up and stain it with 3 different colors, and you get your coat turns all kind of rainbow colors doing it. So it's extremely laborious, extremely expensive, and extremely worthless. So stop ordering ova and parasite exams. The only nice things I can say about GI multiplex panels is they do at least include the parasitic diseases that are associated with chronic diarrheal illnesses that are endemic to the U.S. So unless you got a foreign traveler with bloody diarrhea and there's some other things that won't necessarily be on there, a GI PCR is kind of what you want. And it will catch cyclospora like it will catch many other things. Keep in mind, there is a caveat. Uh, the diagnostic test manufacturer for the GI PCR kind of has a lock on the market.
Hmm.
And the dirty underside of this test is that it has had false positives for years now, for reasons that we are just beginning to understand. And we're talking about all the targets, not just cyclospora can be false positive, but there's a target on there for norovirus, the most common
Mm.
cause of gastroenteritis in the US of A. False positives for that are pretty common. And the manufacturer released a technical bulletin saying, hey, we've been able to verify that there are many of our tests for this that are positive that can't be verified by other methods. And they actually never told this to people straight up, but they made no changes to the test in response to that problem. None. It is the same test that exists when they first released this technical bulletin a couple years back. They had been called on this. And the reason I bring this up with your audience is
Mm-hmm.
this test revolutionized care in American microbiology and really European microbiology too, right? We don't do stool cultures in most big hospital labs anymore because, it's not actionable to know about the salmonella infection you had in 3, 4 days. And, we cover everything we can find on a stool culture almost better with PCR than we can with stool culture. So we've all stopped doing stool cultures. But here's the problem. Once the FDA cleared this test, guess what they make every new test that comes along document as a predicate method. I can't say test B is good enough to diagnose all these other diseases until I compare it to the
The
test we have
GIP.
now. And the
Hmm.
test we have now has some fundamental technical flaws to it, unfortunately. And that there's a beautiful preprint done by UW recently showing that it was a tour de force paper, and I hope it gets through peer review and gets someplace widely published because it essentially shows that the test has all kinds of design flaws where the primer sets that we use in PCR cross-react with
Hmm.
all kinds of normal stool bacteria and cause these false positive reactions, not just for norovirus, but for cyclospora, uh, and amoeba, all this other stuff that, you really are not. So if you get, in other words, a patient and a GI PCR comes back for something that makes no sense. For example, we get a lot of Vibrio positives, and then we try to grow Vibrio, and there's nothing there. And there's Vibrio in the diluent method. When you get the stool to do this test, you have to mix the stool with this thing called Kerry-Blair medium, which is a carrier that makes it store bacteria for culture easier later, which is why they ask for that to be used. But Kerry-Blair medium has agar in it. That's to help anaerobes stay alive better. It helps Campylobacter stay alive. But agar also has, seaweed and DNA in there from Vibrio. And so it causes this false positive reaction just from what we're mixing the stool with before you run the test. Long story short, this test has a lot of technical limitations. We're not seeing better tests getting approved by the FDA because they're being held to the standard of this test that has all these technical limitations. And the tests have not been approved by the FDA because they can't even replicate their own results. Even the one we're using now. So it's a mess out there. I wish we had a better diagnostic that we had more confidence in, but it's the only one we have. But when you get
Hmm.
results that don't make sense, keep that in mind, is that we have this persistent problem with the currently FDA approved diagnostic test for gastroenteritis where there's a lot of false positives out there, and that should be taken into account when you're seeing a patient where the result you're seeing in front of you doesn't match the clinical scenario in front of the patient you're treating.
Wow. Yeah, that's all super interesting. And kind of what I'm hearing is the stool oven parasite that was an answer on step one for us back when we took it is not an answer anymore, basically ever, at least in for the general hospitalist at a major academic medical center for sure.
Just say
Um,
we've been telling ID doctors and gastroenterologists is our next crowd. That they're one of the abusers of that test, and we're actually going down the route of test stewardship because it's such an expensive test and it's such a waste of money in an American hospital to even be doing it.
and so if I'm worried about cyclospora, I'm wanting to test for it. I've gotten a history of more chronic diarrhea. I've gotten my good food history. I order a GI PCR,
Hmm.
but I'm obviously hearing there are caveats with that. You mentioned before,
Here's another scenario I can put in front of your audience that they should
please.
know. Let's say you have a patient who has what looks like classic norovirus.
Hmm.
They're barfing, they're vomiting, diarrhea, and then it's like almost completely better by the time you send that test and you're sitting rounding them on the hospital next day. They're a-okay,
Hmm.
and their test comes back for norovirus and cyclospora, and they're sulfur-allergic, and you're saying, hey, do I need to give them treatment? Well, probably not. This is probably going to be one of these cases where it is positive for a rare entity that it's false. In that scenario, you got two choices. Just watch, wait, and see. Because if it's just norovirus, it's going to get better, stay better. If they get remitting, relapsing disease, okay, you can take that sample and send it on for another method, and you can talk to your local microbiology lab. There's many choices. You can stain it. You can do another dedicated parasite PCR at several different reference labs can be done. But treat the patient in front of you. If the scenario isn't like chronic diarrhea, if there's a lot
Hmm.
of upper GI symptoms with it, that doesn't fit cyclospora, and take the result you're getting with a grain of salt.
And so you're saying for that patient, it sounds like classic norovirus. I discharge them. Should I be doing something to make sure this sample gets held onto in case they're coming back in a week, 2 weeks with the same symptoms? Is there anything I need to do from that standpoint? Should I go ahead and have it sent for further testing, but only treat my patient as if they have norovirus?
I mean, if you're certain that they have norovirus, I
Mm-hmm.
think that's legit. Just let nature take its course. But you might
Yep.
warn them, hey, if you have a relapse in a couple of days, this is all back and it's like not better, then you have two options. One is you could have a conversation with your lab to see if they still have the sample. Like here at our
Mm-hmm.
academic center, we hold our samples for 6 days before they're tossed.
Okay.
Every week we dump out what we got. And you could see if the original sample could be sent for a second diagnostic or just test them again.
Mm-hmm.
And this time just pre-warn your lab, hey, I'm worried they have cyclospora. Do we do the same test we did the last time, or would you recommend us going to an alternative methodology? In our case, it would probably be sent out to a reference lab for there's a specific parasite only PCR test that we could send for cyclospora. And if that's also positive for cyclospora and the patient's relapsing, okay, they probably need some treatment.
Okay. Great. You mentioned you've been working on this inpatient GI-PCR stewardship at MUSC. Do you mention maybe taking this as an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that? Anything you think the audience should know about that initiative?
Yeah, I think people underestimate what a drag this can be on hospital finances and
Mm,
operations. Be sending a test. I mean, this test is not cheap. It costs us between $300 to $600 just to get the cartridge, and the patient charge, depending on your insurance, is going to be somewhere in the $1,000 range. And if you're testing it on an inpatient, it's not covered by insurance. It's part of your hospital care for most individuals, particularly after day 3. The hospital's going to eat that. So the hospital lab can't have nice things if they're running all these really expensive tests that we're not reimbursed to do. And it's just clinically inappropriate
mm-hmm.
because once you've been in the hospital for 3 days and you haven't had, symptoms going on from admission to when you're being tested, the chances that you've got hospital acquired cyclospora or salmonella or, not very high. The only one on the whole panel that I occasionally say is reasonable to test for is if you've got a norovirus outbreak, because norovirus outbreaks happen in hospitals all the time. And
Sure.
in that circumstance, okay, there should be some obvious signs of that, right? There's visitors that are barfing their brains out, or there's people all on the ward, or individuals working in that ward who have been out with kind of brief self-limited gastrointestinal illness, and you want to verify there's an outbreak, fine, send a couple GI PCRs. That would be one reasonable context. But outside of that, it really doesn't make sense to send these $1,000 diagnostics on people who've been sitting in the hospital, particularly if they're on tube feeds, so they're not getting any food that could bring in there intubated. And we see these requests all the time. Hey, we need to have a
Oh yeah.
negative GI PCR before we do a colonoscopy. And I'm like, what? That makes no sense. There's nothing, not a single thing that you could find on a GI PCR that would alter my impression that you need a colonoscopy if you're evaluating a GI bleed, for instance. Okay, you
Mm-hmm.
got norovirus. If you're bleeding someplace badly and you need an endoscopy or a colonoscopy, do it. Uh,
Sure.
that's fine. You don't need a pre-clearance for things and stuff. The other circumstance that we get a lot is, immunocompromised patient with colitis must have GI PCR. No, they don't, because all the things you're looking for are not on it. CMV colitis, not found on a
Mm-hmm.
GI, graft versus host disease, histoplasma, all the things that I think about in transplant ID causing serious colitis. Those are things you need that colonoscopy for. You don't need the negative GI PCR to find things that don't cause, acute colitis in a hospitalized patient. So at our center, we have begun the process of hard stopping. If you've been here for more than 2 hospital days and you order one of these,
Mm-hmm.
you get hard stops. No, can't have it. Is it directs you to get this GI pre-authorization PCR, and then a microbiologist, and sometimes they page me for backup, will say, what is this about? What do you need this for? Is this an outbreak? Is this a specific, oh, they had chronic diarrhea and we didn't get a sample in the first 2 days of admission? Tell us why you want this. Justify it, please. And if it's
Mm-hmm.
justifiable, we let it be done. And if it makes no sense, we will gently deny it and say no. So that's kind of where we are with it. It's not been super popular because people feel like they just want this test and they need this test. And we've even had people, there's a little free text thing where we ask them, why do you need the GI PCR? And it says, because my attending said so, or no, no, so I tell doctors, look, if we don't police ourselves on stuff like this, Medicare is going to do it for us. I mean, this
Sure.
is this is a huge waste of money, and almost every single one, except I think maybe one of the ones that we've kind of reviewed and allowed to be done, have been pan negative. So, or we've directed them to do C. diff testing, which is one of the things on the panel that
Of course.
sometimes makes some, and just do C. diff testing, way cheaper, uh, way more logical to test for, and that's often positive when they do that.
Yeah, I think as hospitalists, a lot of times we like the shotgun test that can
Wow.
make it easy. We've got symptom A, we do test B, it covers everything. We get a reason to blame it on whatever comes up, and then we feel good and we feel like, all right, we've got something to blame it some. The same with the viral respiratory panels. We love to just order those for a fever or cough or whatever, and they're like, okay, we've got something to blame it on. But it sounds like a lot of times inappropriate, and even in addition to the cost, as you were saying earlier, a lot of times we're getting a false positive that then we're blaming it on, which is obviously counterproductive to really clinically treating the patient and giving them appropriate care if we're just finding something to blame it on and it's not even an infection they actually have.
Yeah, we even had a case of Vibrio caught on a GI-PCR of an extended hospitalized patient, and of course the next day they start describing the diarrhea as rice water. And it's like, of course that was totally a false positive. It was a technical bulletin issue, as I call it, not a real vibriosis. But yeah, it sort of instantly changes the way people talk about the symptoms in the chart the minute that there's some positive in the lab confirmed record.
Okay. So if we do get a patient, we were concerned for cyclospora for all the reasons we've talked about. We test and they are positive, or we're strongly concerned. Who should we be treating and how do we treat these patients?
I mean, if they don't have a sulfur allergy, I think everybody should be treated who you have a legit clinical suspicion has it, because
Okay.
this can become truly, I mean, it's not life-threatening for most people, but it's truly disgusting and goes on and on and on before it becomes self-limited. So unlike salmonella, which we way overtreat, by the way, we way, way, way overtreat salmon. We cannot help ourselves, seems like. Oh, salmonella, therefore, but there's actually not a lot of evidence basis behind dishing out all this Cipro for salmonella.
Really?
There's actually not a lot of evidence that shortens illness, but there is evidence in cyclospora. I will grant you, if you got cyclosporiasis, fine, give the Bactrim. I think that is totally worth it to abbreviate illness, and it usually does so within a couple days. It's not instantaneous, but 2, 3 days, most people are better. If they get a serious life-threatening sulfur allergy, then I shrug my shoulders and say, I don't know. You can have us talk to you about some of the iffy data there is for Cipro and other stuff. But the honest answer is we don't know what could be offered to those patients. They should just be counseled. You may be sick for a while, or
Mm-hmm.
you can also dig deep into the self-allergy. Usually self-allergies are so severe that you wouldn't want to be re-exposing people. But if it was a minor rash as a baby and they've never had a re-exposure as an adult, you could think about a challenge or even desensitization if it was a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction. But yeah, like I said, there's not a lot of evidence for what we do in the context of somebody who needs treatment who's got a sulfur allergy.
Um, if we see these patients, and we do are either strongly suspicious they're admitted to the hospital or have a positive GI PCR, should we be calling ID?
I think I would if they're self-allergic. If they're not self-allergic and not otherwise seriously ill, and you just need to get them out the hospital, go ahead and treat them. And
Sure.
you can notify them and ask them to have outpatient follow-up if it's some complexity to the case you want us to follow up on. But I don't think it needs to clog up the discharge line for them just to see us. And what will we do that you won't? Not much, other than maybe we'll dig deep and try to get their grocery store receipts and do the old food history to the nth degree. But there's not a whole lot else we're going to add in most self-limited cases of cyclosporiasis.
um, do we need isolation precautions for these
Nope.
patients?
You actually don't.
Okay.
Standard precautions do the job. Like I said, this is not
Mm-hmm.
spread. There's actually no documented, I went looking the other day, no documented hospital outbreaks, because you basically have to have a farm that your patients are working on, pooping into, and then harvesting fruit and berries and lettuce, serve that lettuce in the hospital, and then you may be able to have a hospital-acquired outbreak. But until we start doing that, God help me, no. Yeah, it's not thought to be possible to have healthcare associated outbreaks of this because it just doesn't come out in an infective stage.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know. And every time anyone lists the foods we've had previous outbreaks associated with, I just imagine the most beautiful summer salad every time. It sounds like it's just the grocery list for a delightful salad.
Yeah,
Um,
but the other thing I tell people though is if you're going to see a patient whose chief complaint is cramps or diarrhea or vomiting and nausea, and you don't put your garbage bag isolation gown and gloves on to see that patient, woe be to you, because the most common cause of that in America is norovirus, which is the most contagious thing there is, except for maybe measles. You gonna get norovirus if you even touch that patient and brush up against them and don't wash your hands perfectly. Even if you wash your hands perfectly, there's gonna be enough norovirus virions on your hands that you're gonna get it. So standard precautions has to mean something. If you're seeing somebody with a chief complaint that's in the GI world and you haven't got that test back yet, put your gowns and gloves on because you're gonna regret it when you get norovirus. That is so incredibly contagious, and really is a reason that you need to kind of get yourself in the mode of think about isolation first. And if it ends up being just cyclospora, fine, you didn't need that stuff. But if it was norovirus or many of the other things that are person to person, especially if you're the one collecting the stool sample. Now, it's just the number of nurses I see in the ER who are just, sticking a bedpan under the patient with a pair of gloves on, and that's it. So, oh boy, here's gonna be my next several thousand emails.
Next patient.
So,
Yeah. um, would we as hospitalists have any reporting responsibilities if we get a positive test?
not directly. So the lab is, of
Okay.
course, required to report to DPH in the state any lab confirmed infections. They will ask us ultimately for a copy of the notes and stuff, and we're good about passing that along in infection control at our institution. You will never get a sour note from the DPH epidemiologists, though, if you really suspect someone's got cyclosporiasis and you've done enough of a food history to identify a putative source. They'd love
Mm,
to know from you ahead of time. So they have a hotline that's on the list of reportable conditions for South Carolina. And anybody in any other state, there's a one sheet list of reportable conditions sheet for almost every health department. It's got the numbers to call of the people that are responsible for your local area. They love to hear from people. They don't often
mhm.
hear from anybody but me at NUSC. But we have, the key, if they like measles, they love, and they require that you can talk to them in real time about uh, high priority diseases like that. But even for
Sure.
low priority stuff like cyclospora, if you've got some advanced knowledge of a potential source, they'd love to hear from you.
Okay. Um, so obviously this is something in the news a lot. Patients are worried about it. What should we be telling patients who are concerned about contracting cyclosporiasis?
I mean, if you're a highly immunocompromised patient, you probably should be really careful about where you get your salads and, source it locally and wash it, take the outer layer of leaves off. Don't buy it pre-chopped, chop it yourself.
Mm,
Easier said than done, right? But if you want to eat healthy and eat cyclospora safe, that's pretty much the only way to do it because there's even if this source, which is probably already controlled by now, right? It's kind of been
right.
yanked off the shelves. There's cyclospora all year round in the same kind of sources, and psoriasis is also out there, same kind of deal. Summertime, warm weather, imported cases all year round. Not much surveillance going on for it. Very hard to find if people aren't sending these expensive diagnostics. So yeah, that's the only prevention right now is buy local and shop it yourself, and good luck with that. That's not practical, especially for patients that can't afford to do that. That's why we're so worried in the public health food safety scheme falling apart on us is that here we are telling people to eat healthy, but then you eat healthy and something like this happens. So it's kind of cross
Mm-hmm.
purpose food recommendations right now,
Oh
which is a
yeah.
shame.
Yeah, it's
I
brutal.
don't want to be the guy, the hospital epidemiologist that tells the world not to eat their vegetables, right? If you are into making this, the summer of cooked vegetables, though, and that would be another way to go about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You cook your cabbage and saute your spinach, and all that stuff is totally safe because cyclospora is way too fragile to survive heat. So it's just really uncooked stuff that's going to be the hard part for us the next couple of weeks.
What about you personally? Has this changed how you're eating or handling fresh produce?
I don't ever buy bagged salad stuff, although my kids do, and I'm like, stop it. But yeah, the closest I'll come is I love arugula, and sometimes it's hard to find arugula that's not already kind of been washed for you and stuff. But at least get
Mm-hmm.
one thing that's not mixture of other stuff. So I know, all right. this grocery store is selling me arugula in a bucket, and it's just got arugula in it. So, I hopefully so far so good. But yeah, there's only so much you can do in terms of safe living. And if I end up getting any of these, I'll duly produce my sample and see what it is. But so far so good.
All right. So finally, what is the single most important thing you would like hospitalists to do differently after hearing this conversation?
I think take good food histories and test aggressively for patients that are being admitted with a gastroenteritis syndrome, even if it's kind of a minor part of their presentation. People
Hmm.
coming with chest pain. American hospitals are great at chest pain. They exceed expectations when it comes to chest pain. They underwhelm me when it comes to GI illness. They really do. We have patients that come in with weeks of diarrhea from a nursing home, and they get missed and they get diagnosed with hospital-acquired C. diff because nobody even bothers to take a history about that review system and send a test until they've been in the hospital for 4 or 5 days. So I think aggressively take a GI review systems, aggressively test for patients that are being admitted with upper or lower GI symptoms and get those tests ordered and collected quickly before you end up in, diagnostic stewardship territory. And if you get something that you've never heard of before on that GI PCR panel, call a microbiologist or an ID doc to help you sort through it, because this is not going to be the only weird disease that we're going to see foodborne outbreaks from. Not the way that public health surveillance is headed nowadays.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Curry, for joining me and giving us your time and helping us make sense of all of this.
Thank you for caring about explosive diarrhea.
So, my takeaway, this outbreak doesn't demand a major new approach on the front end. Instead, it sharpens focus on what we should already be doing when we admit patients with gastrointestinal symptoms. If a patient is being admitted with upper or lower GI symptoms, even if those symptoms are only a minor part of the presentation, order and collect the GI multiplex PCR for all its flaws early, ideally at admission, rather than waiting until they've been sitting in the hospital for 4 or 5 days. The patient we should be thinking about cyclosporiasis in has prolonged diarrhea. If the clinical picture and testing support cyclosporiasis, a month of explosive diarrhea is bad enough that we should be treating these folks. For an immunocompetent adult, that means one double strength Bactrim twice daily for 7 to 10 days. If the patient has a severe sulfa allergy, is significantly immunocompromised, or the diagnosis or treatment is otherwise complicated, it's reasonable to consult ID. But for a severe sulfa allergy, recognize that there are not proven and effective alternatives at this time. Thank you again to Dr. Scott Curry for joining me. And this has been an Inpatient Update News Flash.